The gunshot cracked through the trees, so close that Elena felt it in her chest before she heard it in her ears. She slammed the brakes of her old truck, tires sliding on wet gravel, and for a moment, the whole forest seemed to hold its breath. Rain hammered the windshield. Another shot rang out, further this time, and then a third, followed by a sound that made her stomach twist. A deep, pained howl, not a bark, not a growl, a cry. She should have driven straight home. That was what any sensible person would do at 11 at night on a storm-soaked road outside a town, where hunters sometimes lost their heads and their aim after a few hours in the dark. But Elena had never been very good at doing the sensible thing when something was hurting. She grabbed the flashlight from the glove box, pulled her jacket tight, and stepped out into the rain. The mud sucked at her boots as she moved off the road and into the tree line, her light cutting through sheets of water. Branches slapped against her arms. Somewhere ahead, men were shouting to each other, their voices rough with excitement, the kind of excitement that came from being close to something they wanted badly. "Got him boxed in near the ridge," one voice called. "Don't let him slip past you again," Victor said. "This one's worth more than the last 3 combined." Elena's light swept over broken undergrowth, drag marks in the mud, a scattering of shell casings glinting like small silver teeth. Her heart pounded. She was not a hunter. She was not brave in the way people meant when they used that word carelessly. She was a woman who fixed broken wings on barn owls and stitched up farm dogs that got too close to combine harvesters. But something in that howl had reached into her and would not let go. She rounded a fallen log and stopped. In the clearing ahead, caught between 2 boulders with nowhere left to run, stood a wolf, larger than any she had ever seen in pictures, or on the nature programs Grace liked to watch. His gray fur was matted dark with rain and blood along one shoulder. His flank rose and fell too fast, too shallow. His eyes, when they found her, were not the flat animal eyes she expected. They were sharp, alert, and full of something that looked almost like disbelief, that a human had wandered into this exact wrong place, at this exact wrong time. 3 men stood at the clearing's edge, rifles raised. The tallest of them, a broad-shouldered man in a green rain slicker, noticed her first. "Get back," he snapped. "This isn't your business, miss." "You're going to kill him," Elena said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "That's the general idea," said a second man, younger, with a cruel little smile that made her skin crawl. The wolf did not move. He watched her instead of them, as if trying to decide what she was doing there, why she wasn't running, why her light was now pointed at the men instead of at him. "There are laws about hunting wolves in this county," Elena said, stepping fully into the clearing, despite every nerve in her body screaming at her to stop. "I know the ranger. I know the numbers. This species is protected within 5 miles of the reserve line, and we are inside it." It was not entirely true. She was guessing at the boundary, throwing out anything that sounded official enough to make 3 armed men pause. For a long, terrible second, nobody moved. Then the tall one lowered his rifle half an inch. "Lady, you have no idea what you just walked into." "I know exactly what I walked into," she said. 3 grown men, with guns, cornering one wounded animal in the rain. Doesn't seem like something you'd want a witness for. The younger man laughed, but it was the tall one who mattered, and Elena watched something calculate behind his eyes. Money. Risk. Whether a stubborn woman with a phone in her pocket was worth the trouble of a job that was already messier than it should have been. "Fine," he said at last, spitting into the mud. "He's bleeding out anyway. Won't make it through the night. Let the forest have him." They melted back into the trees, grumbling, and within a minute, the only sound left was the rain and the wolf's ragged breathing. Elena did not move for a moment, half expecting the men to circle back. When she was sure they were truly gone, she lowered her flashlight and took one slow step toward the wolf. He snarled, low and warning, baring teeth that could have taken her hand off at the wrist. She stopped immediately. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, I hear you. I'm not going to hurt you." He watched her with those impossibly aware eyes, blood running in a thin dark line down his front leg, where the bullet had grazed him deep enough to open the skin, but, thankfully, not deep enough to have shattered bone. She had seen enough injured animals to know the difference between a wound that would kill by morning and one that only felt like it would. "You're hurt," she said, keeping her voice low and even, the tone she used on frightened dogs brought in after accidents. I'm not one of them. I want to help you. I know that probably doesn't mean anything to you right now, but I need you to trust me for about 30 seconds, because if I don't stop that bleeding, you actually might not make it." The wolf's ears flattened. His whole body was coiled, ready to either flee or fight, and Elena understood that either one was possible, and that she had no real way of stopping him if he chose the second option. But she also understood, in some part of her that did not run on logic, that he was watching her the way a creature watches something it has decided, for the moment, not to kill. She crouched slowly, making herself smaller, less threatening, and held out her empty hands. "My name is Elena," she said, feeling faintly ridiculous, introducing herself to a wolf, in the middle of a storm. "I live about 2 miles from here. I have a barn with clean straw, and no other animals in it right now. It's warm, it's dry, and nobody is going to come looking for you there." The wolf's breathing slowed, just slightly. He did not attack. He did not run. He simply watched her, weighing something she couldn't guess at, some calculation that had nothing to do with hunger or fear, and everything to do with a decision only he understood. Then, impossibly, he took one limping step toward her. Elena's breath caught. She stayed perfectly still, letting him choose the distance between them, and when he was close enough that she could see the individual raindrops caught in his fur, she reached slowly into her jacket and pulled out the small first aid roll she kept in the truck for exactly this kind of unplanned emergency, though she had never once imagined using it on something quite this large. "This is going to sting," she warned him, unwinding a length of bandage. "I'm sorry in advance." He flinched when the cloth touched the wound, but did not pull away, did not snap, did not do any of the things every instinct in her body had warned her he might do. She worked quickly, wrapping the injury tight enough to slow the bleeding, murmuring the same low-nonsense words she used on frightened animals in her clinic, words that meant nothing and everything at once. "You're safe. Almost done. Good. You're being so good." If she had known, in that moment, exactly what she was kneeling beside in the mud and the rain, she might not have been able to keep her hands from shaking, but she did not know. She only saw a wounded animal that needed help, and so she gave it, the way she always did, without asking what it might cost her later. When the bandage was as secure as she could make it in the dark, she stood and looked toward the trees in the direction of her truck. "I can't carry you," she admitted. "You're going to have to walk, or I'm going to have to leave the truck here and come back for it in the morning, because there is no way you're fitting in the cab like this." The wolf considered her for a long moment, and then, slowly, painfully, began to walk in the direction she had gestured, favoring his injured leg, but moving with a determination that told her he understood, somehow, exactly what she was offering him. The walk back to the truck took nearly 20 minutes at his pace, both of them soaked through, neither of them speaking, though only one of them could have. Elena kept a careful distance, close enough to guide him, far enough to give him room to change his mind if he needed to. He never did. At the truck, she opened the tailgate and spread an old blanket she kept for hauling feed sacks. The wolf eyed the height of the bed doubtfully. "I know," she said. "It's not exactly first class. But it's better than the alternative." With effort that clearly cost him, he gathered himself and leapt, landing awkwardly but successfully, and collapsed onto the blanket with a huff of exhausted breath. Elena closed the tailgate gently and climbed into the cab, glancing back through the rear window every few seconds as she drove, half convinced she had imagined the entire encounter, half convinced that the enormous gray shape lying in her truck bed was about to vanish into the storm the moment she looked away. He did not vanish. He was still there when she pulled up to her barn 20 minutes later, still breathing, still watching her with those unnervingly intelligent eyes as she lowered the tailgate and stepped back to give him space. "Welcome to your temporary home," she said quietly, gesturing toward the open barn door, warm lamplight spilling out across the wet ground. "Nobody's going to hurt you here. I promise you that." The wolf held her gaze for a long moment, rain dripping from his fur, blood already staining through the fresh bandage. Then, with the slow, deliberate movement of a creature making a choice rather than simply following instinct, he stepped down from the truck and limped past her into the light. Elena stood in the rain a moment longer, watching him go, feeling the strange weight of what she had just done settle over her shoulders. She had no idea that the animal now standing in her barn, wounded and wary, carried a title that meant more in these mountains than any law she had bluffed about back in that clearing. She had no idea that the men who fled had been paid a fortune to find exactly this wolf, and that they would not simply give up because one woman with a flashlight had frightened them off for a single night. All she knew, as she closed the barn door against the storm, was that something in his eyes had asked her a question, and something in her had already answered yes. Inside, she moved carefully, switching on the second lamp so the barn glowed soft and gold instead of harsh and white. The wolf had already found the deepest pile of straw in the corner, near the old feed bins, and had lowered himself into it with the stiff, careful movements of someone guarding an injury far worse than a single graze along the leg. Elena noticed, for the first time, other marks on him, a scar across one shoulder, old and pale, half hidden beneath the fur, a slight unevenness in the way he held his front paw, as though it had been broken once, and healed without proper care. This was not his first brush with violence. Whatever life this animal led, it had already asked a great deal of him before tonight. She filled a shallow bowl with water from the tap near the tool bench and set it down a careful distance away, then stepped back, giving him room. He watched her for a long moment before dragging himself over to drink, slow and deliberate, never once taking his eyes fully off her. "You don't trust easily," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "I don't blame you." She thought, briefly, of calling Grace, her closest friend, and the only other person in the county who would believe her, without immediately suggesting she'd had too much wine. But it was late, the rain was loud on the tin roof, and some part of her did not want to share this yet, did not want to turn this strange, private moment into something that had to be explained and justified to someone else. Tomorrow, she told herself. She would tell Grace tomorrow, when the wolf was steadier, and she had a better idea of what exactly she had brought home. She gathered a second blanket from the shelf near the door, folded it, and set it down within his reach, not close enough to startle him, close enough that he could pull it toward himself if the night grew cold. Then she checked the bandage one more time, relieved to see the bleeding had slowed to almost nothing, and finally allowed herself to breathe out the tension she had been carrying since the moment she'd heard the first gunshot. "I'll check on you in a few hours," she told him, backing toward the door. "There's food if you get hungry, though I imagine wolves aren't exactly interested in kibble. I'll figure something out in the morning." He watched her go, his amber eyes catching the lamplight, and just before she pulled the door closed behind her, she could have sworn she saw something shift in his expression. Not fear anymore, not even wariness, not entirely. Something closer to curiosity, as if he too were trying to understand why a stranger had walked so willingly into danger, for a creature that owed her nothing, and could not even thank her in words. Elena crossed the yard back to the house, through rain that had softened to a drizzle, glancing back once at the barn's glowing window before letting herself inside. She peeled off her soaked jacket, hung it by the door, and sat for a long moment at her kitchen table, hands still trembling faintly from the adrenaline of it all. She had no way of knowing that, at that very hour, 3 men were reporting their failure to a fourth, a man they answered to who did not tolerate excuses. She had no way of knowing that somewhere deep in the mountains beyond her farm, an entire pack was beginning to whisper about their missing prince, wondering where their fiercest protector had vanished to, and why, for the first time in living memory, he had not returned by moonrise. All Elena knew, as she finally climbed the stairs to bed, was that there was an injured wolf in her barn who looked at her as though he understood every word she said, and that some quiet, stubborn part of her heart had already decided she would do whatever it took to see him through the night. Elena woke before dawn to the sound of something heavy shifting against wood. She sat up fast, heart hammering, before she remembered exactly why there might be noises coming from her barn at 4 in the morning. She pulled on a sweater, shoved her feet into boots without bothering with socks, and hurried out across the yard, the grass still silver with dew and last night's rain. Inside, the wolf had dragged himself closer to the door, as if he had been trying to reach it, or perhaps only trying to see outside. He froze when she entered, ears pinning back, and for a moment, Elena worried she had imagined the whole gentle understanding of the night before, that daylight had returned him to something wilder and less willing to be touched. "Hey," she said softly, crouching just inside the doorway. "It's just me. I heard you moving. Are you in pain?" He watched her, breathing hard, and after a long moment the tension eased slightly from his shoulders. He did not come toward her, but he did not retreat either, and Elena took that as permission enough to approach slowly, and checked the bandage she had wrapped the night before. The wound looked better than she had feared. The bleeding had stopped entirely, and though the flesh around it was swollen and clearly sore, there was no sign of the infection she had worried about, no heat radiating from beneath her fingers when she checked. Wolves healed fast, she knew that much from documentaries and articles, but even accounting for that, his recovery seemed remarkable. "You're tougher than you look," she told him, "and you already looked pretty tough." He made a low sound in his chest, not quite a growl, something closer to acknowledgement, and Elena found herself smiling, despite the ache in her own tired body. She spent the next hour doing what she could. She brought out strips of cooked chicken from her refrigerator, uncertain whether he would accept food from her hand, but hoping he might at least eat from a bowl placed nearby. He watched the bowl for a long moment, then looked at her, then finally, cautiously, extended his neck and ate, never taking his attention fully off her face as he did. "There," she said, pleased. "That's a start." She talked to him as she worked, the way she talked to every frightened creature that passed through her care, filling the silence with a steady stream of ordinary words. She told him about the farm, about the goats she used to keep before a fox got too bold one winter, about Grace, who ran the diner in town and worried about her living out here alone. She told him she had wanted to be a proper veterinarian once, before life and money had narrowed her path into something smaller, but no less meaningful, patching up what she could with the resources she had. The wolf listened, or seemed to, tilting his head at certain words, watching her with an attention that felt less like the vague curiosity of an animal, and more like the focus of someone actually following a conversation. More than once, she caught herself pausing mid-sentence, struck by the strange sensation of being truly heard by something that could not answer back. By mid-morning, she had to leave for the small clinic she ran out of a converted shed near the edge of town, tending to the farm animals and family pets of neighbors, who could not afford the larger practices 2 towns over. She hesitated at the barn door, reluctant to leave him alone. "I have to go to work," she told him, feeling faintly foolish for explaining herself to a wolf. "I'll be back by evening. There's water, there's food, and nobody knows you're here. Just stay hidden, all right? For your own sake." He watched her leave, with an intensity that stayed with her the entire drive into town, and it was that same intensity that made her keep glancing at her phone throughout the day, half expecting some disaster, some sign that the hunters had returned, though she had no real way of knowing if they would. Grace noticed her distraction almost immediately. She dropped by the clinic in her lunch break, 2 coffees in hand, and took one look at Elena's face, before setting the cups down with a knowing sigh. "All right, what happened?" Grace said. "You've got that look." "What look?" "The look you get when you've done something reckless, and you're trying to decide whether to admit it." Elena hesitated, weighing how much to say. In the end, she told a version of the truth, careful and incomplete. A wolf, injured, hunters in the woods, a decision made in the moment that she couldn't quite explain even to herself. She left out the way his eyes had seemed to understand her, the way he'd walked toward her instead of away, the strange certainty she'd felt that this was not simply an animal reacting to kindness, but something closer to a choice. Grace's eyebrows climbed steadily higher through the telling. "You brought a wolf home, an actual wild wolf, and you're keeping him in your barn." "He was hurt, Grace. What was I supposed to do? Leave him to bleed out in the rain?" "I'm not saying you should have left him. I'm saying most people, upon finding an enormous wild predator with teeth built for taking down deer, do not then invite it to stay in a building 30 feet from where they sleep." "He's not dangerous," Elena said, surprising herself with how certain she sounded. Grace studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful crossing her expression. "You sound very sure of that for someone who met him 12 hours ago." Elena didn't have a good answer for that, not one she could put into words that wouldn't sound strange even to her own ears. So she simply shrugged and said she'd be careful, and Grace, though clearly unconvinced, let the subject drop with the kind of reluctant trust that came from years of friendship. The rest of the day passed slowly, Elena's mind repeatedly drifting back to the barn, to the wolf lying in the straw, to the unsettling sense she carried that whatever she had pulled from that clearing the night before was not simply lost or ordinary. When she finally locked up the clinic and drove home as the sun dipped low over the ridgeline, she found herself pressing the accelerator a little harder than usual, eager in a way she didn't fully understand, to see whether he was still there, still safe, still watching for her return. He was waiting near the barn door when she arrived, as if he had heard the truck's engine from a mile away, and positioned himself accordingly. He was standing now, weight still favoring the injured leg, but steadier than the night before, and something in the way he held himself, upright, alert, almost regal despite his condition, struck Elena as strange without her quite being able to name why. "You're standing," she said, delighted despite herself. "That's a good sign." He took a slow step toward her, then another, closing more of the distance between them than he had allowed the night before. Elena held perfectly still, letting him decide the pace, and when he finally stopped close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his fur, she found herself reaching out, slowly, giving him every opportunity to pull away. He did not pull away. He lowered his head, just slightly, allowing her fingers to brush against the fur behind his ear, and Elena felt something in her chest loosen, that she hadn't realized was tight. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, we're friends now. Is that what this is?" He huffed a breath that almost sounded like agreement, and for the first time since the storm the night before, Elena laughed, a small surprised sound in the quiet evening air. That evening, Elena brought a folding chair out to the barn and sat with him for a while, the way she sometimes sat with nervous animals recovering from surgery, simply keeping them company so they would not feel so alone with their pain. She brought a small lantern and a book, though she found she read very little, more often watching the wolf where he rested in the straw, his breathing slow and even, his eyes half closed but never fully asleep. "You know," she said, breaking the comfortable silence, "most wild animals would have bitten my hand off by now. Or at least tried to run, the moment I opened that barn door. You haven't done either." He lifted his head slightly at the sound of her voice, ears swiveling toward her. "I don't know what that means," she continued half to herself, "but I like it. I like that you're not what I expected." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old barn's tin roof, and Elena noticed the wolf's attention sharpen for a moment, his head lifting fully, nostrils working the air as though catching some scent carried on the breeze. She followed his gaze toward the tree line at the edge of her property, where the shadows had grown long and thick with the coming night. "What is it?" she asked quietly. He held perfectly still for several long seconds, and Elena found herself holding her breath along with him, some old instinct telling her that whatever had caught his attention was not nothing. Then, slowly, his shoulders relaxed, and he lowered his head back down, though his eyes stayed open a moment longer than before. She would not learn until much later that a lone wolf from a neighboring territory had passed close to her land that evening, drawn by curiosity over an unfamiliar scent, and that the prince resting in her barn had warned him off with nothing more than a low, warning breath carried on the wind, a silent message understood by anyone of his kind who happened to catch it. He was not simply healing in her barn. He was, in whatever quiet and careful way he could manage from within an injured body, still protecting the boundaries of a life she knew nothing about. "You're a mystery," Elena told him eventually, closing her book without having read more than a page. A big, gray, extremely patient mystery. He made a soft sound that might have been amusement if wolves could manage such a thing, and Elena smiled, gathering her things as the night deepened around them. "I'll bring breakfast early," she said, standing and stretching stiff muscles. "Something better than plain chicken, I promise. You've earned it." She paused at the door, looking back at him one more time before switching off the lantern. In the dim light filtering through the barn's high windows, his eyes caught the glow for just a moment, luminous and strange, and something about the sight sent an unexpected shiver down her spine, not of fear, but of the sense that she was standing closer to something ancient and important than she had any way of understanding. "Good night," she said softly, and stepped out into the cool dark, leaving him to whatever thoughts a wolf might carry through the long hours until morning. Cale watched her go, the barn door easing shut behind her, and allowed himself, for the first time since the hunters had cornered him 2 nights before, something close to genuine rest. He had spent years surrounded by wariness, by advisors who wanted things from him, by rivals who watched for weakness, by a title that demanded he never once appear anything less than unshakable. He had forgotten, somewhere along the way, what it felt like to simply be cared for without condition, without calculation, without anyone wanting anything from him in return. It troubled him, how easily he had let his guard down around her. It troubled him more that some part of him did not want to leave, not yet. Not until he understood what exactly it was about this quiet, stubborn, endlessly kind human woman that had made him choose to trust her within a single storm-soaked night. When trust was something he had learned, through hard and bitter experience, to never give away so easily. He closed his eyes at last, listening to the wind move through the trees outside, and let himself drift, for a few hours at least, into something almost like peace. 3 days passed, and with each one, Cale grew stronger. By the 4th morning, he could walk without favoring his injured leg, could run a slow circuit around the edge of Elena's property without his breath catching, could leap the low fence separating her land from the neighboring field with barely a hint of the stiffness that had crippled him the night she found him. He knew, somewhere in the practical part of his mind that never fully stopped calculating, that he should leave. His pack needed him. His absence would already be raising questions among the elders, and questions among wolves like his had a way of turning quickly into opportunities for those who wished to see him weakened. And yet, each evening, when Elena returned from her clinic in town, tired and smelling faintly of antiseptic and hay, and called out a greeting to him across the yard, as though he were an old friend rather than a wild animal she had known less than a week, something in him resisted the pull to leave. He told himself it was caution, that he could not risk shifting back to his human form so close to where the hunters had found him, not until he was certain they had truly given up the search. He told himself it was practicality, that a few more days of rest would serve him better in the long run than a hasty return before his body had fully healed. He told himself many reasonable things, and he almost believed them. The truth, though he did not care to examine it too closely, was simpler than any of his careful justifications. He wanted to stay. He wanted, for reasons that unsettled him more than any physical wound ever could, to see what tomorrow with her might look like. So each night, once Elena had gone to sleep, he slipped from the barn and moved silently through the darkness, patrolling the boundaries of her land, the way he might once have patrolled the borders of his own territory, though here, there was no pack depending on him, no rivals testing his strength, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that nothing would trouble her sleep while he kept watch. He found, on one such night, a fox attempting to raid the small chicken coop she kept behind the house, and chased it off with nothing more than his presence. A low growl carried on the wind that sent the smaller creature scrambling back into the brush. He found, on another, 2 young deer grazing too close to the road where cars sometimes came too fast around the bend, and herded them gently back toward the safety of the trees, an old habit from his younger years spent learning to protect creatures weaker than himself. And each morning, he returned to the barn before dawn, curling into the straw as though he had never left, so that when Elena arrived with her arms full of food and her voice full of warmth, she found him exactly where she had left him the night before, giving her no reason to suspect the quiet work he did while she slept. "You're looking better every day," she told him one morning, crouching to check the now nearly healed wound along his shoulder. "I think in a few more days, you're not even going to need these bandages." He watched her fingers move with careful precision, and found himself, not for the first time, studying the details of her face, the way he might once have studied the terrain of unfamiliar territory. The small scar above her eyebrow, the calluses on her palms from years of physical work, the way her expression softened without her seeming to notice it whenever she spoke to him, as though some part of her had already decided he deserved a kindness she rarely allowed herself to show so plainly to anyone else. Grace visited again that same afternoon, and this time she came prepared, standing at a respectful distance from the barn door, with her arms crossed and an expression that suggested she had spent the intervening days building a case in her head. "I looked it up," Grace announced without preamble. "Wolves that size don't just wander down from nowhere. There's a den territory about 20 miles north of here that wildlife services have been tracking for years. If your friend really is one of theirs, someone official is eventually going to come asking questions." "He's not hurting anyone," Elena said, glancing toward the barn where Cale lay, watching the exchange with an alertness that Grace, thankfully, seemed to attribute to ordinary animal curiosity, rather than genuine comprehension. "That's not really my concern, Elena. My concern is you, alone out here, getting attached to something that belongs in the wild, and has absolutely no business learning to trust humans. What happens when he heals up and decides to leave? What happens if he doesn't leave, and one day he's not as gentle as he's been so far?" Elena didn't have an answer that would satisfy her friend's very reasonable worries, so she simply promised to be careful, the same promise she had made days before, and Grace, though clearly still troubled, let the matter rest for the time being. But after Grace's truck had disappeared down the long drive, Elena found herself lingering by the barn door, turning her friend's words over in her mind. What would happen when he healed? It was a question she had been avoiding since the very first night, some quiet dread taking root beneath all the warmth she felt whenever she was near him. The certainty that whatever this strange companionship was, it could not last forever. That was, after all, the entire meaning of the word. She sat beside him that evening, longer than usual, watching the sun sink behind the ridge in streaks of orange and violet, and found herself talking more openly than she had in years, about her parents, gone now for the better part of a decade, about the veterinary program she'd had to abandon halfway through when the money ran out, and her mother's illness demanded every spare hour and dollar she had, about the quiet loneliness of building a life out here on the edge of town, capable and independent, and, if she was honest with herself, deeply isolated. "I don't tell people this stuff," she admitted, plucking a piece of straw and turning it over in her fingers. "I don't know why I'm telling you. Maybe because you can't tell anyone else." Cale, listening with an attentiveness that went far beyond anything a simple animal could offer, felt something shift inside his chest that he did not have a name for. He had spent his entire life being listened to, being watched, being measured for weakness or strength by everyone around him, and yet he could not recall the last time anyone had simply spoken to him without wanting something in return, without calculating how his response might serve them. He wished, watching the firelight of the setting sun catch in her hair, that he could tell her who he truly was. He wished he could explain the danger that still followed him even here, in this quiet corner of the world, where she had built her small, careful life. But he knew, with the same certainty that had kept his pack safe through years of careful leadership, that the moment she learned the truth, everything about this fragile, unexpected piece would change. She would look at him differently. She might fear him. She might, worse still, become a target for anyone who wished to strike at him through the people he cared for, and he had already seen, in his years of rule, exactly what his enemies were capable of when given a weakness to exploit. So he stayed silent, as he always did, and simply leaned his head against her knee when she finally fell quiet, offering the only comfort available to a creature who could not speak the truth he most wanted to share. Somewhere far to the north, in the shadowed halls of the Nightfall stronghold carved into the mountain rock, Dorian sat at the head of a long table surrounded by elders, whose patience was beginning, visibly, to wear thin. 4 days, one elder said, her voice sharp with concern. 4 days without word from our prince. This has never happened before. Not once in all his years of leadership. Perhaps, Dorian said smoothly, folding his hands atop the table, with the practiced calm of someone who had spent years learning to hide his true feelings behind pleasant expressions. Our prince has simply chosen to take some time away from his duties. He has, after all, carried a great deal of weight alone for a very long time. Or perhaps, said another elder, older and far less easily reassured, something has happened to him, and we are wasting precious time sitting here discussing possibilities, instead of sending out search parties. Dorian's expression did not change, though something cold flickered briefly behind his eyes. I have already dispatched trackers to comb the southern ridge, he said. If our prince is out there, we will find him. And if he is simply resting somewhere, gathering his strength after whatever encounter left those hunters bragging in town about a wolf that got away, then I imagine he will return to us in his own time, as he always has. The elders seemed, for the moment, satisfied by this response, though Dorian noted the lingering uncertainty in more than a few faces around the table. He allowed himself a small, private smile once the meeting had ended and the hall had emptied, thinking of the trackers he had indeed sent out, though not with the intention the elders imagined. He did not want Cale found safe. He wanted Cale found weak, vulnerable, far from the protection of his stronghold, in exactly the sort of position that would allow certain long-delayed plans to finally, quietly, come to fruition. That same night, 2 of Dorian's trackers moved through the forest south of Elena's farm, following a faint trail of scent that had grown stronger the closer they drew to the tree line bordering her property. They were careful, professional, chosen precisely because they knew how to move without being seen or heard, and they carried with them instructions that had nothing to do with rescue and everything to do with confirming a location that could later be shared with people far less concerned about discretion. Cale caught their scent from nearly half a mile away, the moment the wind shifted in his favor, and every muscle in his body went taut with a wariness that had nothing to do with the ordinary caution of a healing wound. He knew that scent, faintly, the particular mix of mountain herbs and leather that marked wolves from his own territory, rather than strangers passing through. Someone from home had found him. He rose from the straw where he had been resting and moved to the edge of the barn, peering out through the gap beneath the door at the dark yard beyond. The trackers were still a good distance off, moving along the tree line rather than approaching directly, clearly searching rather than certain, but the danger was unmistakable. If they came close enough to catch his scent clearly, close enough to confirm what they likely already suspected, there would be no explaining away his presence here, and worse, there would be no way to guarantee that Elena's home would not become entangled in whatever conflict his absence had already begun to stir among his own kind. He slipped out through the small gap in the boards at the rear of the barn that Elena did not know existed, moving low and silent through the shadows, circling wide until he came up behind the two trackers, from a direction they would not expect. He did not attack. Attacking would only confirm his location beyond doubt and risk revealing far more than he wished anyone, even his own trackers, to see. Instead, he released a low, rolling growl into the night air, the particular tone and rhythm of it carrying a meaning, understood by every wolf trained within his territory. A warning, a command, leave this ground. The trackers froze, exchanging a glance in the darkness, clearly recognizing the authority in that sound, even if they could not immediately place its source. After a long, tense moment, they withdrew, moving quickly back the way they had come, unwilling to risk confronting whatever had issued that particular warning, without knowing exactly what they were dealing with. Cale watched them go from the shadow of an old oak at the property's edge, his heart still hammering with an urgency that had nothing to do with physical exertion. They had come too close, far too close, and they would return, likely with more of their kind, until they either found what they were looking for, or exhausted every possible lead. He made his way back to the barn as the first hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky, and settled once more into the straw, though sleep did not come easily. He thought of Elena, asleep in her house just across the yard, entirely unaware of how narrowly her quiet, ordinary life had just brushed against a danger she could not begin to imagine. He thought of the growing certainty that his time here was, despite every wish otherwise, running short. When Elena arrived that morning with her usual armful of food and her usual warm greeting, she paused at the barn door, studying him with a small frown. "You look tired," she said, crouching to examine him more closely. "Did something happen last night? You seem on edge." He wished, more fiercely than he had wished anything in a long time, that he could simply tell her. Instead, he leaned into her hand when she reached out to stroke the fur along his neck, letting the warmth of her touch settle some of the unease still coiled tight in his chest. "Whatever it is," she said softly, "you're safe here. I mean that." He wanted, more than he had wanted almost anything, to believe her. But some part of him, the part that had spent years learning the hard way, that safety was never guaranteed, and peace never lasted as long as one hoped, understood that the danger circling closer through the trees would not simply give up and go home. And when it finally arrived at her door in full, he would have to decide, once and for all, exactly how much of himself he was willing to reveal in order to keep her from being caught in the middle of it. By the end of the first week, Elena had stopped calling him simply the wolf in her own head, though she had not yet settled on anything that felt quite right. She tried a few names out loud, watching for any reaction, more out of habit than any real expectation that he would respond to one over another. "Duke," she offered one evening, and he gave her a look so flat and unimpressed that she laughed out loud. "All right, not Duke." "What about Ranger?" He simply blinked at her, unmoved. "You're a hard audience," she told him, settling back against the barn wall with her knees drawn up. "What about Shadow? You move like one. Half the time I don't even hear you until you're already right beside me." At that, something shifted in his expression, a subtle alertness that she might have missed if she hadn't already spent a week learning the small signals of his moods. He huffed once, low and warm, and pressed his head briefly against her knee. "Shadow, then," she said, satisfied, reaching out to scratch behind his ear. "It suits you. Quiet, careful, always right where I don't expect you." He did not mind the name. In truth, hearing her say it, watching the small private smile that crossed her face each time she used it, stirred something in him that felt dangerously close to affection, a feeling he had not allowed himself in longer than he cared to admit. Among his own kind, he was Kale, Alpha Prince, heir to a bloodline that had ruled these mountains for generations. Here, in this quiet barn with this quiet woman, he was simply Shadow, and there was a freedom in that smaller name that he had not expected to treasure so quickly. Their days settled into an easy rhythm. Elena would rise early, check on him before heading to the clinic, and return each evening to find him waiting, often now standing at the fence line rather than resting in the straw, his body nearly fully healed, his strength returning in ways that occasionally startled her when she caught glimpses of it. He cleared the low pasture fence in a single fluid leap one afternoon, while chasing off a stray dog that had wandered too close to her chickens, moving with a speed and precision that seemed, to her growing unease, far beyond what she understood wolves to be capable of. "You're not exactly an ordinary wolf, are you?" she murmured one evening, watching him circle the yard with an alertness that never seemed to fully relax, even in moments of apparent calm. "I don't know what you are, exactly, but I don't think you're ordinary." He held her gaze a beat too long, and something passed between them, unspoken but unmistakable, an acknowledgement that she had noticed something true, even if she could not yet name it. It was nearly 2 weeks after that first storm-soaked night when the real test came. Elena had stayed later than usual at the clinic, tending to a difficult birth in one of the Hensley Farm's mares, and by the time she finally started the drive home, full darkness had settled over the valley, the moon hidden behind a thick bank of clouds that promised rain before morning. She was tired in the particular way that came from hours of careful physical work, her attention only half on the road, as she navigated the familiar curves toward her farm. She did not notice the second vehicle until it was already close behind her, headlights cutting through her rearview mirror, with an aggressive brightness that made her squint. It stayed close, too close, matching her speed exactly, and when she slowed slightly to let it pass, it slowed as well, refusing to overtake. Her pulse quickened. She reached for her phone in the cup holder, fingers fumbling slightly, and had just enough time to register the truck accelerating hard, closing the gap between them, before her own vehicle lurched sideways as something struck her rear bumper. She fought the wheel, tires skidding on the loose gravel shoulder, and managed to keep the truck from sliding fully into the ditch, though the impact had rattled her badly enough that her hands were shaking against the wheel. Behind her, the other vehicle had stopped as well, and 2 figures climbed out, moving toward her, with a purposefulness that made every instinct in her body scream danger. She recognized, with a cold lurch of fear, the broad-shouldered man in the green rain slicker from that first stormy night, the one who had lowered his rifle only after she had bluffed her way through a confrontation she had no real authority to win. "Small world," he said, approaching her window with an expression that held none of the reluctant caution she remembered from before. "We've been asking around, you know. Folks talk about the woman with the wolf out at the old Miller farm. Didn't take much to put it together." "I don't know what you're talking about," Elena said, though her voice betrayed her with a slight tremor. "Sure you don't," the man said, resting a hand against her door. "Here's the thing, though. That wolf you're so fond of, he's worth a lot more alive than the reward we were originally chasing. Someone's very interested in getting him back, and very willing to pay whoever brings him in. So why don't you just tell us where he's keeping himself these days, and we'll leave you out of the whole mess entirely." Elena's mind raced, fear tightening into something sharper, more protective. "There's no wolf," she said. "You're wasting your time." The man's patience, thin to begin with, snapped visibly. He reached for her door handle, and Elena's hand shot instinctively to the gear shift, ready to force the truck forward, even with the other vehicle blocking her path, when a sound split the night that made every hair on her body rise. A howl, close, powerful, unlike anything she had heard even from him during their weeks together, rolled across the valley with an authority that seemed to shake the very air. The man froze, his hand still on her door, and his companion, waiting by the second truck, took an instinctive step backward, clearly recognizing something in that sound that Elena did not yet understand. Then Kale arrived. He came out of the darkness at a speed that defied everything Elena thought she knew about the limits of an animal's body. A blur of gray and muscle that hit the man at her door, with enough force to send him sprawling into the gravel. The impact controlled, precise. More warning than injury, but unmistakably, terrifyingly powerful. The second man scrambled back toward the truck, shouting something Elena couldn't quite make out over the roar of her own pulse in her ears. And within moments, both vehicles were reversing hard down the road, tires spinning against loose stone, retreating from whatever they had just witnessed, with far more urgency than they had approached. Elena sat frozen behind her wheel, breath coming in short, shocked gasps, watching as Kale stood in the middle of the empty road, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the retreating taillights, until they had disappeared entirely around the bend. Then he turned to look at her, and something in his expression, some blend of concern and barely restrained fury, made her chest ache in a way she didn't fully understand. "You," she whispered, climbing shakily out of the truck. "How did you even know? How did you get here so fast?" That's not normal, Shadow. Nothing about what just happened was normal." He approached slowly, favoring caution over speed now that the immediate threat had passed, and pressed his head gently against her trembling hands, offering the only comfort he could without words. "They knew about you," she said, voice cracking slightly. "They said someone's looking for you. Someone who's willing to pay to get you back." She pulled back slightly, studying him with an expression caught between fear and something far more complicated. "What are you? What did I actually bring home that night?" He held her gaze, and for the first time since she had found him bleeding in that clearing, Elena saw something in his eyes that looked almost like grief, the particular sorrow of a creature who wanted desperately to answer a question he could not yet find a way to speak. She drove the rest of the way home with Kale running alongside the truck, matching her speed with an ease that only deepened her sense that everything she thought she understood about him had been, at best, a partial picture. When they reached the farm, she sat in the driveway for a long moment before finally climbing out, her legs still unsteady beneath her. "I need to check your car for damage," she said, though her voice was distracted, her mind clearly elsewhere. She circled to the rear bumper, running her fingers over the dented metal where the other vehicle had struck her, and found herself, absurdly, more shaken by the memory of that howl than by the collision itself. Kale waited nearby, watching her with the particular stillness of someone bracing for a conversation he could not have, and when she finally straightened and turned back toward him, her expression had settled into something calmer than he expected, though no less serious. "Okay," she said, taking a slow breath. "Here's what I know. Wolves don't move like you just moved. They don't understand words the way you seem to. And they definitely don't have men driving trucks and offering rewards to get them back." She crossed her arms, studying him in the dim porch light. "I don't know what you are. Maybe I don't need to know tonight. But I need you to know that whatever you are, I'm not scared of you. I'm scared for you. Those men are going to come back, aren't they?" He held her gaze and, slowly, deliberately, lowered his head in something that could only be understood as a nod. "Right," she said, exhaling. "Then we need a plan that's better than you waiting around to fight them off every time they show up." She spent that night with the porch light left on, unable to fully settle despite her exhaustion, checking the window every hour or so to reassure herself the yard remained empty and quiet. Kale, for his part, did not return to the barn at all, choosing instead to keep watch from the edge of the porch steps, close enough that she could see his shape through the window whenever her worry pulled her from sleep. A silent, steady presence that did more to calm her nerves than any lock or alarm could have managed. In the morning, over coffee she barely tasted, Elena called Grace and told her, in careful, edited detail, about the men who had run her off the road. She left out the howl, left out the impossible speed, left out the growing certainty forming in the back of her mind that Shadow was not simply a wolf who had wandered unusually far from his territory. Grace, alarmed and immediately protective, insisted on driving out that same morning and spent an hour pacing Elena's kitchen, alternating between fury at the men involved and renewed worry about the wolf still living in the barn. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Grace said. "Whatever's going on with that animal, it's put a target on your back now too. You need to call the sheriff, Elena. Actual authorities, not just me worrying at you over coffee." "And tell them what?" Elena said. That 2 men in a truck ran me off the road looking for a wolf that scared them off with a growl? They'd think I'd lost my mind, or worse, they'd come out here and take him away, before I could even explain. Grace fell quiet at that, studying her friend with an expression that held more concern than argument. "You really care about this animal," she said eventually, not quite a question. "I do," Elena admitted, surprising herself with how simply the words came. "I don't fully understand why, or what exactly he is, but I do, and I'm not going to let a couple of men with guns scare me into abandoning him." Grace sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Then at least let me stay out here with you for a few nights. 2 sets of eyes are better than 1, and frankly, I want to actually meet this remarkable wolf everyone in town keeps whispering about." Elena agreed, grateful for the company even as some quiet, private part of her worried about what Grace might notice, watching Shadow up close for the first time, that she herself had already begun to suspect. That evening, as the 2 women sat together on the porch steps, and Cale approached cautiously from the yard, Grace's breath caught audibly at the sheer size of him up close, at the strange, deliberate intelligence in the way he studied her, before finally, apparently satisfied, settling at Elena's feet.
"Elena," Grace said quietly, not taking her eyes off him, "that is not an ordinary wolf."
"No," Elena agreed, resting her hand gently on his fur. "I don't think he is." Neither of them spoke the deeper suspicion gathering unspoken between them, the sense that whatever secret this creature carried was larger and stranger than either of them was quite ready to name aloud. But as the 3 of them sat together beneath the darkening sky, watching the tree line for any sign of returning danger, Elena found herself holding tightly to the one certainty she did not doubt at all. Whatever Shadow truly was, she was not going to let anyone take him from her without a fight of her own. Deep within the Nightfall stronghold, carved into the granite heart of the northern mountains, Dorian moved through the private study that had once belonged to his uncle, running his fingers along the spines of old ledgers that recorded generations of pack law and lineage. It was not his study. It would likely never be his study, not through any legitimate path, and that simple fact had curdled into something bitter and patient inside him over the many years he had spent standing one step behind the throne rather than upon it. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He straightened his posture before answering, arranging his features into the calm, reasonable expression the pack had come to expect from him. "Enter." The man who stepped inside wore the plain clothes of someone accustomed to moving unnoticed through human towns, and though he was not pack himself, he had proven useful over the years, a broker of information and, when necessary, of more dangerous services. "Your trackers came back with nothing conclusive," the man said without preamble. "But there's talk in the valley towns. A woman living alone near the old Miller farm, keeping an unusually large wolf on her property. 3 men went out to collect on it 2 nights ago, and came back saying they'd been run off by something that moved faster than anything they'd ever seen." Dorian's expression did not change, though something sharpened behind his eyes. "The Miller farm. That's close to the ridge where the original hunting party lost him." "Close enough," the man confirmed. "If it is your missing prince, he's found himself a very devoted protector. The woman apparently drove off the first group of hunters herself, unarmed, before he was even strong enough to defend himself." Dorian considered this information carefully, turning it over the way he turned over every piece of intelligence that came to him, searching for the angle that would serve his purposes best. A human protector was not, on its own, particularly useful to him, but a human protector that Cale had apparently grown attached to, one he had trusted enough to remain injured and vulnerable beside for what was now approaching 2 full weeks. That was something else entirely. That was leverage of a kind he had not anticipated but which suited his purposes remarkably well. "I want eyes on that farm," Dorian said. "Not our trackers. They've already been noticed once, and I won't risk drawing more attention than necessary. Hire humans who can watch without being seen for what they are. I want to know this woman's routine, her habits, everyone she speaks to, and I want to know exactly how strong our prince's attachment to her has grown." The man nodded and turned to leave, but paused at the door. "And if it turns out he cares for her a great deal, what then?" Dorian allowed himself, for just a moment, the thin, satisfied smile he rarely showed to anyone within the stronghold's walls. "Then we will have found precisely the sort of weakness that has always been missing from our prince's otherwise inconveniently solid reputation." That evening, the Elder Council convened once more, and this time the questions came sharper, more insistent. The patience that had carried the pack through the first days of Kale's absence, clearly beginning to fray. 2 weeks, said the elder, named Beatrice, her silver hair drawn back in the severe style she had worn for as long as anyone could remember. 2 weeks without a single confirmed sighting of our prince. I want to know, Dorian, exactly what your trackers have accomplished in all this time, because from where I sit, it looks a great deal like nothing at all. My trackers have narrowed the search considerably, Dorian said smoothly. We believe he was injured in the encounter with the hunters, more seriously than initial reports suggested, and has likely been recovering somewhere in the southern valleys, away from packlands, precisely to avoid drawing danger toward the rest of us while he was vulnerable. That is speculation, Beatrice said sharply, not fact. It is the most reasonable explanation available to us, Dorian replied, his tone carefully patient, the voice of a man who understood he was speaking to frightened, frustrated people, and had no interest in adding to their distress. I assure you, Elder, no one wishes for our prince's safe return more than I do. But hasty, uncoordinated searches risk exposing our people to exactly the kind of human attention we have spent generations avoiding. I would rather move carefully and find him alive than move recklessly and find nothing at all. The council murmured amongst themselves, and though Beatrice's expression remained unconvinced, she did not press the point further, at least not in the open forum of the full gathering. Dorian noted, with quiet satisfaction, how easily the fear in the room could be shaped and redirected, how a few carefully chosen words could turn a council's growing suspicion of his own inaction into gratitude for his supposed caution and restraint. After the meeting dispersed, Beatrice lingered in the emptying hall, watching Dorian gather his papers with the same unhurried calm he always projected. She had known him since he was a young wolf, watched him grow from an ambitious but ultimately loyal cousin of the prince into something colder and more calculating with each passing year, though she had never been able to point to any single moment where that change had truly taken root. You have always wanted this seat, she said quietly, once the others had gone. Dorian looked up, feigning surprise at the bluntness of the accusation. I want our prince found safely, Beatrice, nothing more. I have known you a very long time, she said, stepping closer, her voice dropping lower still, and I have never once seen you move as carefully, or as patiently, as you have these past 2 weeks. Careful patience, in my experience, usually means someone is waiting for exactly the right moment to act. You give me too much credit, Dorian said, though something in his eyes, just for an instant, betrayed a flicker of the calculation she had suspected all along. I hope that is true, Beatrice said, turning to leave. For your sake, and for the pack's. Because if I ever find proof that you have delayed his rescue, or worse, orchestrated his absence for your own gain, you will find that my patience, unlike his trackers, does not run nearly so long. She left him alone in the hall, and Dorian stood in the quiet for a long moment afterward, the pleasant mask he wore for the council slipping slowly from his features, revealing beneath it something far more dangerous, the cold, patient hunger of a man who had waited a very long time for his chance, and did not intend to let a suspicious old elder, or anyone else, stand in his way, now that it had finally, unmistakably, begun to arrive. He called for the human broker once more, before the night was through, and gave a final set of instructions, quiet and precise, regarding the woman at the Miller farm, and the wolf she had so unwittingly agreed to protect. Watch them both, Dorian said. And when the moment is right, I want you to make certain our prince understands, in the clearest possible terms, exactly what he stands to lose if he does not return to face what is coming for him. Miles away, on the quiet edge of the Miller farm, Cale woke in the gray hour before dawn, with every sense, suddenly, sharply alert. He had grown used to the ordinary sounds of Elena's land, the creak of the barn's old boards settling, the distant lowing of the Hensley cattle across the valley, the wind moving through the tall grass beyond the fence. This was different. A stillness had settled over the property that felt deliberate rather than natural, the particular quiet that came when something was watching, holding itself carefully out of sight. He rose from the straw and moved to the gap in the boards, scanning the tree line with a patience born of years spent guarding borders far more dangerous than this. For a long while, he saw nothing, only shadows and the first gray light beginning to touch the horizon. Then, near the old fence post at the property's edge, he caught the faintest suggestion of movement. Gone, almost before he registered it. A shape that did not belong to any deer or fox he had grown familiar with over these past weeks. Human, not one of the hunters who had come before, their scent and manner distinct from this newer, quieter presence. This was someone trained to watch without being seen, someone who had likely been there for some time, before Cale's senses finally caught the threat of their presence. His chest tightened with a dread that had nothing to do with his own safety. If someone was watching the farm now, carefully, patiently, rather than crashing through the trees with guns raised, it meant the search for him had entered a more calculated phase. It meant, almost certainly, that whoever had sent them understood there was more to gain here than simply capturing an injured wolf. It meant Elena was no longer simply an inconvenient witness. She had become, in the eyes of whoever orchestrated this search, a piece worth studying, worth understanding, worth potentially using. He spent the rest of that morning in a state of restless vigilance, circling the property's edges long after Elena had left for the clinic, searching for any further sign of the watcher, though whoever it was had apparently withdrawn once the sun rose fully, unwilling to risk discovery in daylight. He found, near the fence post, the faint impression of boots in the softened earth, evidence enough to confirm what his senses had already told him, though not enough to identify who exactly had left them there. When Elena returned that evening, he was waiting by the porch steps, his agitation clearly visible even to her, who had come to read his moods with increasing skill over their weeks together. "You're jumpy tonight," she observed, setting down her bag and crouching to study him more closely. "Did something happen while I was gone?" He wished, more desperately than he had allowed himself to wish in days, that he could simply tell her everything. The pack, the title he carried, the rivals who had begun circling, now that his absence had stretched long enough to be noticed and exploited. He wanted to warn her properly, to explain the shape of the danger closing in around them both, rather than relying on growls and pressed heads, and the small, inadequate vocabulary of gestures available to him in this form. Instead, he did the only thing within his power. He stayed close to her that evening, closer than usual, refusing to settle even after she had gone inside for the night, patrolling the yard with a restless energy that eventually drew her back out onto the porch, wrapped in a blanket against the evening chill. "You're not going to rest until you've walked every inch of this property, are you?" she said, watching him from the steps. He paused near her, pressing his head briefly against her knee before resuming his circuit, and Elena, watching him go, felt the same quiet unease that had been building in her ever since the men on the road had spoken of rewards and someone very interested in getting him back. She did not yet understand the shape of what was coming, but she understood, with the same instinct that had once sent her out into a storm to save a stranger she owed nothing to, that whatever it was drawing closer, and that the peaceful weeks she and Shadow had built together in this quiet corner of the world were not going to last much longer without a reckoning of some kind. She stayed on the porch long after the temperature had dropped, watching his shape move steadily through the darkness, and found herself praying, in the quiet, wordless way she prayed for injured animals during difficult surgeries, that whatever was coming would find them ready for it. The reckoning came 4 nights later, and it came with teeth. Elena had gone to bed early, worn thin from a long day at the clinic, and Cale had taken up his usual post near the edge of the yard, senses stretched wide across the darkened property. It was nearly midnight when he caught the scent, faint at first, then unmistakable. 3 wolves moving through the trees at the property's northern edge, their gait deliberate, coordinated, nothing like the aimless wandering of territorial strangers. He knew immediately these were not ordinary wolves. The discipline in their movements, the way they spread to cover multiple approaches at once, spoke of training, of purpose, of someone giving them very specific instructions, and he understood, with a cold certainty that settled deep in his chest, exactly who might have sent them. He moved to intercept them well before they reached the house, meeting them in the open pasture where he would have room to maneuver, and where, more importantly, their confrontation would stay far from Elena's window. The largest of the 3, a rangy brindle wolf with a jagged scar across one ear, stepped forward, as the others fanned out around him. "Dorian sends his regards," the brindle wolf said, his voice carrying the particular resonance of pack communication, words shaped from growls, and posture that only another wolf could fully understand. "He wondered how long you'd hide out here, playing house with a human, while your own people wonder if you're even alive. Tell Dorian, Cale said, his own voice dropping into the same low, resonant register, that I have never once needed his permission to decide where I recover from an injury his hired hunters caused. He also wondered, the brindle wolf continued, ignoring the response entirely, whether the woman you've been sheltering with means enough to you that you'd risk everything to protect her. We're here to find out. The attack came without further warning, all three wolves lunging at once with the coordinated precision of a pack that had trained together, and Cale, still not fully recovered from his earlier injuries, found himself fighting with an intensity he had not needed to summon in longer than he cared to remember. He drove the brindle wolf back with a combination of speed and raw strength that left the smaller animal staggering, then pivoted to intercept a second attacker before its jaws could close on his already weakened flank. The fight was brutal but controlled on his part, every movement calculated to disable rather than destroy, a restraint born of the understanding that these wolves were pawns rather than true enemies, following orders rather than acting from any grievance of their own. He caught the second wolf by the scruff and threw it hard against the base of an old oak, hard enough to end its part in the fight without lasting harm, then turned just in time to meet the third attacker's charge head-on. It was this final exchange that reopened the wound along his shoulder, the barely healed flesh tearing beneath the force of the collision, and Cale felt the familiar hot rush of blood beginning to soak through fur that had only just begun to feel whole again. He fought on despite it, driven by an urgency that went beyond simple survival, the growing awareness that the longer this confrontation continued in the open pasture, the greater the risk that Elena would wake and come to investigate the noise. He finally drove all three attackers back into the tree line, with a final surge of strength that cost him dearly, his vision swimming at the edges, his legs threatening to give out beneath him the moment the immediate threat had retreated. The brindle wolf paused at the tree line's edge, looking back at him with something that might have been reluctant respect. "You're weaker than you used to be," the brindle wolf observed. "Dorian will be pleased to hear that. We'll be back, Prince, and next time we won't be quite so restrained in our methods." They vanished into the darkness, and Cale, alone in the pasture, with blood soaking steadily through his fur, felt his legs finally buckle beneath him. It was the sound of his fall, a heavy, unmistakable thud against the earth that woke Elena from her uneasy sleep. She was at the window within seconds, and what she saw in the moonlight sent her flying down the stairs and out into the yard barefoot, heedless of the cold ground beneath her feet. "Shadow!" she called, dropping to her knees beside him, where he lay in the pasture grass, his breathing ragged, blood dark, and glistening against fur that had only just begun to fully heal. Oh no. What happened? Who did this? She was reaching for the wound, already calculating in her mind what supplies she would need, how she would manage to get him back to the barn in this state, when something began to happen that made every rational thought in her head simply stop. His shape began to shift. It was not sudden, not violent in the way she might have imagined if she had ever allowed herself to imagine such a thing at all, but slow, almost painful, fur receding into skin, bones reshaping themselves with a series of small, terrible sounds, until the enormous gray wolf she had tended for weeks had become, impossibly, a man. He lay in the grass before her, tall and broad-shouldered, dark hair damp with sweat, a wound along his shoulder in almost exactly the same place the wolf's injury had been, bleeding just as freely. His eyes, when they opened and found hers, were the same amber gold she had come to know so well, unmistakably, impossibly the same. "Elena," he said, her name rough and strained in a voice she had never heard before, though somehow she knew, with absolute certainty, that it belonged to him. She sat frozen in the grass, staring at him, her mind struggling to reconcile the wolf she had rescued with the man now bleeding in front of her, every instinct screaming that this should not be possible, even as the evidence lay directly before her eyes. She started, then stopped, unable to find words adequate to the moment. "You're a person. You were a person the whole time." "I can explain," he said, wincing as he tried to push himself upright, the movement clearly costing him more than he let on. "Please, just let me explain. I never meant for you to find out like this." "Explain," Elena said, her voice shaking now, caught somewhere between fear and a strange, disorienting relief that at least some part of the mystery had finally revealed itself. "Yes, I think you'd better explain. Right now. But he was losing too much blood to explain anything properly, his eyes beginning to lose focus even as he tried to hold her gaze. And Elena, training overriding shock in the way it always had whenever she was faced with an injured creature needing her help, forced herself back into motion. Later, she said firmly, already moving to support his weight as he struggled to stand. You're going to explain everything later, when you haven't just been in whatever fight put that gash in your shoulder. Right now, I need to get you inside before you bleed out on my lawn. He managed, with her help, to stumble across the yard and into the house, and Elena guided him to the couch, working quickly and efficiently despite the tremor still running through her hands, cleaning and dressing a wound on human skin for the first time that night, though her fingers moved with the same careful precision she had used on his wolf form weeks before. Who did this to you? She asked once the bleeding had slowed, and he lay pale, but stable against her cushions. And don't tell me it doesn't matter, because clearly, it matters a great deal. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face, weighing, one final time, how much of the truth he could afford to share. But looking at her now, at the fierce protectiveness in her eyes even after everything she had just witnessed, he understood that the time for careful half-truths had finally, completely run out. My name is Kale, he said quietly. And there is a great deal I need to tell you about who I am, and why those wolves came here tonight looking for me. Elena sat down slowly in the chair across from him, pulling a blanket around her shoulders against a chill that had little to do with the temperature of the room. I'm listening, she said. Start wherever makes sense. There are people, he said carefully, wolves, like the one you found in that clearing, who live differently than ordinary wolves do. We can take this shape, and we can take another. Most humans never learn we exist at all, and we prefer it that way. It keeps us safe, and it keeps the people we might otherwise put in danger safe as well. And the men who ran me off the road, Elena said. The wolves who attacked you tonight, they're the same as you? The men were human, hired by someone who wanted to profit from finding me, Kale said. The wolves tonight belong to my own kind. They were sent by someone who wants me weakened, someone who has been waiting a long time for an opportunity, like the one my injury gave him. Elena absorbed this slowly, her mind still catching up to the impossibility of the entire conversation. Why would anyone want you weakened specifically? What makes you so important that people are willing to hire hunters and send fighters after you? Here, Kale hesitated, and Elena watched the hesitation with a sharpening attention that told him she had already noticed there was more to the story than he had offered so far. I hold a position within my community, he said finally, choosing his words with obvious care. A position of some responsibility. It has made me enemies over the years. Wolves, who believe they would serve that role better than I do, or who simply resent that I hold it at all. That's vague, Elena said, not unkindly, but with the directness of someone who had spent the last several weeks earning a right to honesty. You're being vague on purpose. I am, he admitted. Because the full truth is complicated, and because the more you know, the more danger it could bring to your door. You've already been threatened once because of me. I don't want to make that worse by burdening you with everything all at once. Elena studied him for a long moment, weighing his caution against her own growing frustration. In the end, she decided not to press further that night, some instinct telling her that whatever he was still holding back, he would tell her when he trusted her enough, and that trust, given everything they had already built together, was not something she needed to force. Okay, she said instead. For tonight, I'll accept the outline. You're something my grandmother would have called a shapeshifter, if she believed in such things, which she probably did, now that I think about it. You have enemies within your own kind, and the wolves who attacked you tonight are going to come back. Almost certainly, Kale said. Then we need a better plan than you fighting them off alone in my pasture every few nights, Elena said, echoing almost exactly the words she had spoken to him days before, back when she had thought she was speaking to an ordinary wolf who could only understand tone rather than meaning. The realization that he had understood every single word she had ever said to him, every private confession about her parents and her abandoned dreams and her quiet loneliness out here on the edge of town, settled over her with a fresh wave of something complicated, part embarrassment, part a strange and unexpected tenderness. You heard everything, she said slowly. All those nights I sat with you and just talked. You understood all of it. Kale's expression softened, something vulnerable crossing his features that she had never seen on the wolf's face, though she realized now it had likely been there all along, simply harder to read. "Every word," he confirmed quietly. "And I want you to know, none of it made me think less of you. If anything, it made me—" He paused, searching for words that would not overstate what he was not yet ready to fully name. "It made me grateful. More grateful than I've been for anything in a very long time." Elena felt her cheeks warm despite the seriousness of the evening, and she busied herself checking his bandage again, partly to give her hands something to do besides betray how much his words had affected her. "Well," she said, "I suppose it's only fair, since apparently I've been talking to a person this entire time, and not just a very good listener with fur." He managed a small, tired laugh at that, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his healing wound, and Elena's expression softened in turn, the earlier fear and shock giving way, slowly, to something steadier. "Rest," she told him, standing to fetch a spare pillow from the hall closet. "We'll figure out the rest of it tomorrow, when you're not bleeding on my couch, and I've had time to fully process the fact that my wolf can apparently turn into an extremely handsome man, with terrible timing." "Handsome," Kale repeated, one eyebrow lifting, despite his exhaustion. "You think so?" "Don't get used to the compliments," Elena said, though she couldn't quite keep the smile from her voice, as she draped a blanket over him and dimmed the lights. "You still have a lot of explaining left to do." She sat up long after he had drifted into an exhausted sleep, watching the rise and fall of his chest in the dim glow of the porch light filtering through the curtains, turning over everything she had learned that night. A shapeshifter, enemies within his own kind, a position of responsibility he had not yet named. She did not know, not yet, exactly how deep the truth ran, or what title he was still so carefully avoiding, but she knew, watching him sleep with the same quiet vigilance she had once offered him in the barn, that whatever came next, she had already decided she was not going anywhere. Over the following days, Kale remained in his human shape more often than not, his shoulder healing steadily under Elena's careful attention, and the two of them settled into a new, stranger, but no less comfortable rhythm than the one they had shared before. He was careful about being seen, wary of drawing attention that might reach back to his pack before he was ready to face them, but he found himself, more and more, wanting to simply exist alongside her in the small, ordinary moments of her daily life. He learned to make coffee the way she liked it, strong and slightly too sweet, after she teased him for 3 mornings straight about how badly he'd botched it the first time. He sat across from her at the kitchen table in the evenings, while she went through the clinic's paperwork, occasionally offering opinions on cases that revealed, to her quiet surprise, an understanding of animal behavior, far more sophisticated than she would have expected from someone who claimed no formal training. "You know an awful lot about wound care for someone who's never mentioned any veterinary background," she observed one evening, watching him point out a detail in her notes about a dog's recovering leg fracture. "I've had a great deal of personal experience with injuries," he said dryly, and she laughed, understanding the joke, even as it skirted close to truths he still hadn't fully shared. He accompanied her into town twice that week, careful and a little tense at first, watching the streets with the alertness of someone who had spent years learning to read danger in unfamiliar spaces. Grace met him properly for the first time at the diner, and Elena watched her friend's sharp, assessing gaze move over him with obvious calculation. "So your shadow," Grace said, sliding into the booth across from them with a raised eyebrow. "Funny." Elena described a wolf. "Not a devastatingly handsome stranger, who apparently makes her laugh more in 1 week than I've managed in the past year. It's a long story," Elena said, kicking Grace lightly under the table. "I have time," Grace said, unbothered, studying Kale with open curiosity. "Where are you from exactly? I don't recognize the accent, and I know pretty much everyone who passes through this county." "Far north of here," Kale said smoothly, the answer practiced enough that Elena suspected he had prepared it in advance. "A small community, mostly private. We don't get many visitors, and we don't send many out either." "Mysterious," Grace said, though her tone carried more amusement than suspicion, at least on the surface. "Well, mysterious or not, you're clearly good for her, and that counts for a lot in my book." After Grace left for her shift at the diner's counter, Elena studied Kale over the rim of her coffee cup. "She likes you," she said. "That's not nothing. Grace doesn't warm up to strangers easily." I noticed she was still watching me rather closely on her way out, Cale observed. That's just Grace being Grace, Elena said, though privately she suspected her friend had noticed more than she let on, and would likely have questions of her own once they were alone again. She was right. Grace called that same night, her voice careful in the particular way that meant she had been turning something over in her mind. He's not from around here, she said without preamble. Obviously. But it's more than that, Elena. There's something about the way he watches everything, the way he moves. It reminds me of those documentaries about Special Forces soldiers, all that controlled awareness. Where did you really find him? Elena hesitated, torn between her instinct toward honesty with her closest friend and the promise she had silently made to protect whatever secret Cale was still working up the courage to fully share. It's complicated, she said finally. I promise I'll explain everything eventually. I just need a little more time to understand it myself first. Grace, to her credit, did not push further, though her parting words carried a weight of genuine concern. Just be careful, all right? Whatever this is, whoever he really is, I don't want you getting hurt in ways I can't help you patch up. Elena promised she would be careful, though even as she said it, she understood, somewhere deep and quiet, that the danger circling them both had already moved past the point where simple caution could fully protect her. The near miss came 3 days later, on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon errand into town. Elena had stopped at the small hardware store to pick up supplies for a fence repair, Cale waiting outside near the truck, when she noticed a man across the street, watching the store's entrance, with an attention that seemed just slightly too focused to be casual. He wore ordinary clothes, nothing that would draw a second glance under normal circumstances, but something in the deliberate way he lingered, checking his phone without ever actually looking at it, set off a quiet alarm in her mind. She paid for her supplies quickly and stepped back outside, and it was Cale who noticed first, his posture shifting subtly, protectively, angling himself between her and the man across the street without drawing obvious attention to the movement. We're being watched, he said quietly, helping her load the supplies into the truck bed with movements that appeared entirely casual to anyone observing. The man across the street? Elena asked, keeping her own voice equally light as she climbed into the driver's seat. He's been there since we arrived, Cale confirmed, sliding into the passenger side. And he was watching the diner 3 days ago as well, though I didn't want to alarm you until I was certain. Elena's hands tightened on the wheel as she pulled out of the parking space, glancing once in her mirror to confirm the man had not moved to follow on foot, though she suspected, given everything she now understood about the world Cale belonged to, that following on foot was hardly the only method available to someone determined to track their movements. Your pack, she said, the ones who sent those wolves after you. They're the ones watching us now? Almost certainly, Cale said, his jaw tight with barely restrained frustration. Someone within my pack has decided that watching you, learning your routines, understanding exactly how much I care for your safety, is worth more to them than simply forcing a direct confrontation. And what happens? Elena asked carefully, once they've learned everything they think they need to know? Cale was quiet for a long moment, watching the road unwind ahead of them, his expression carrying a weight she had not seen on him since the night he had first shifted back into human form on her lawn. Then, he said finally, I imagine they will use it, and I am going to have to decide, very soon, exactly how much longer I can afford to hide from what's coming, before it finds its way to your door instead of mine. That night, once the fence repairs were finished, and the sun had dropped low behind the ridge, Elena found Cale, standing at the edge of the pasture, looking north, toward the mountains, with an expression she had come to recognize as longing mixed with dread, the particular look of someone thinking of home, and everything that home now demanded of him. She crossed the grass to stand beside him, saying nothing at first, simply letting her presence settle into the quiet, the way it always seemed to, when the weight of the world pressed too heavily on him. You miss it, she said eventually, whatever life you left behind up there. I miss parts of it, he admitted. The mountains themselves, certain people who have never once made me feel like a burden or a target, but most of what waits for me up there is exactly the kind of weight I came down here, however unintentionally, to escape for a little while. Tell me about it, Elena said. Not the parts you're afraid will put me in danger, just tell me who you were, before all of this, before the hunters, before the wolves in the pasture, before any of it. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a rare, unguarded softness. "I was raised to believe that strength was the only currency that mattered," he said. "That showing anything less than complete control made you vulnerable to anyone circling for an opportunity. I have spent most of my life surrounded by people who wanted something from me, who measured every word I said for weakness they could exploit later. I forgot, somewhere along the way, what it felt like to simply exist without that constant calculation. And now?" Elena asked softly. "Now," he said, turning to look at her fully, the last light of the sun catching gold in his eyes. "I have spent weeks in your company, first as a wolf who could offer you nothing but silence, and now as a man who still cannot offer you the full truth of who I am. And in all that time, you have never once asked me for anything beyond honesty, and safety, and the simple decency of not lying to you outright. I had forgotten such a thing was possible." Elena felt her chest tighten with something warm and complicated, an emotion she had been carefully avoiding naming, even to herself over these past weeks. "That's not exactly nothing to offer someone," she said quietly. "Honesty and safety. Some people spend their whole lives looking for that and never find it. You deserve more than what little of the truth I've given you so far," he said, "and I intend to give you the rest, all of it, very soon. I only ask that you understand why I've waited this long. It was never about distrust of you. It was only ever about protecting you from the consequences of knowing too much too soon." "I understand," Elena said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it completely. Whatever remained unspoken between them, she had watched him fight for her safety, with a ferocity that left no doubt about where his loyalties truly lay, and that certainty mattered more to her, in this moment, than any remaining mystery about his exact standing among his own kind. He reached out, slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished, and brushed a strand of hair from her face with a gentleness that seemed almost at odds with the raw power she had witnessed him wield against 3 attacking wolves only days before. "Elena," he said quietly, "whatever happens next, whatever my enemies decide to do with the knowledge they've gathered watching us these past days, I need you to know that meeting you in that clearing was the single most fortunate accident of my entire life." "It wasn't an accident," Elena said, a small, unsteady smile touching her lips despite the weight of everything they had discussed. "I made a choice that night. I heard something hurting, and I chose to help. I'd make that same choice again, every single time, even knowing everything I know now." He studied her for a long moment, something fierce and tender warring behind his eyes, and then, slowly, he closed the remaining distance between them and pressed his lips gently to her forehead, a small, careful gesture that carried more weight than words could have managed. "Then let us hope," he murmured against her hair, "that whatever choice I am forced to make next proves worthy of the one you already made for me." They stood together in the deepening dusk a while longer, the mountains looming dark and patient in the distance, carrying within their shadowed peaks a pack council, growing more restless by the day, a rival prince tightening his web of watchers and spies, and a reckoning that both of them now understood, with equal and growing certainty, could not be postponed for very much longer. The call came from Grace's diner just after noon, and Elena knew from the first ragged breath on the other end of the line that something was terribly wrong. "Elena," Grace said, her voice tight with barely controlled fear, "there were men here, asking about you. About Shadow. They didn't threaten anyone directly, but they were asking specific questions, about your schedule, about whether you were alone most days. I didn't like the way they looked at me when I said I didn't know anything." Elena's blood ran cold. She was standing in her clinic's small office at the time, a stack of paperwork forgotten on the desk in front of her, and she felt Cale's presence beside her sharpen instantly, his attention locking onto her sudden tension even before she had relayed a single word of what Grace had said. "What is it?" he asked, low and urgent. "Men at the diner," Elena said, hanging up quickly. "Asking about me. About you. Grace says they wanted to know if I was ever alone." Cale's expression darkened into something Elena had not seen from him before, a cold, focused fury that transformed his features into something closer to the powerful creature she had first found bleeding in that forest clearing. But safety, it turned out, was not a luxury they were going to be given the chance to arrange. They were barely 5 minutes into the drive back toward the farm, when a vehicle pulled out from a side road and fell into position behind them, and this time there was no pretense of casual following. It closed the distance aggressively, and within moments a second vehicle appeared ahead, blocking the narrow county road entirely, forcing Elena to brake hard as both cars boxed her truck between them. "Stay behind me," Cale said, already moving, throwing open his door before the truck had fully stopped, positioning his body between Elena and the men climbing out of both vehicles with a speed and purpose that left no doubt about their intentions. There were 5 of them this time, more than had come before, and Elena recognized, with a sick lurch of dread, the broad-shouldered man in the green rain slicker among them, his earlier caution apparently replaced by something far more determined now that the stakes had clearly been raised. "Evening," the man said, an ugly satisfaction in his voice. "Funny how things work out. Turns out our employer isn't actually all that interested in you anymore, Wolf. Turns out he's far more interested in the woman standing behind you." Elena felt Cale go rigid beside her, understanding landing between them both in the same terrible instant. This was never truly about capturing him. It had always, from the moment Dorian's watchers confirmed the depth of his attachment, been about her. "You will not touch her," Cale said, his voice dropping into something low and dangerous that seemed to carry farther than an ordinary human voice should, a resonance that made even the hardened men before him hesitate for half a beat. "Not our call to make," the man said, gesturing, and 2 of his companions moved wide, attempting to flank around toward Elena's side of the truck, while the others held Cale's attention directly. What happened next occurred faster than Elena could fully track. Cale moved with a speed that defied ordinary physics, closing the distance to the nearest flanking man before he had taken more than 3 steps, disarming him with a brutal economy of motion that left the man crumpled and gasping on the gravel without a single shot fired. He spun to intercept the second flanker, and Elena, heart hammering, backed toward the truck's open door, searching desperately for any advantage she might offer. She found it in the tire iron tucked beneath her seat, grabbing it just as one of the remaining men lunged toward her, and swung it hard enough to catch his shoulder and send him staggering back with a shout of pain and surprise. It was not elegant, and it was not without cost, her arms aching from the impact. But it bought Cale the half-second he needed to finish disabling the second flanker and turn his full attention back to the man in the green slicker, who had raised his rifle in the confusion and was now leveling it directly at Elena. "Enough," the man snarled. "One more move from either of you, and I put a bullet in her before you can take a single step." Cale froze, every muscle in his body coiled with barely restrained violence, forced into the terrible calculation of a creature who could easily overpower every human in front of him, but could not outrun a bullet already aimed and ready to fire. "Let her go," Cale said, his voice raw with something Elena had never heard from him before, a desperation that cut through even the danger of the moment. "Whatever Dorian promised you, I will pay more. Whatever you want, name it, and I will see it done. Just let her go." "Funny," the man said. "Our employer said you'd say something exactly like that. Said it would prove everything he needed to know." He never got the chance to say more. A shape came out of the trees at the road's edge, with a speed and silence that caught everyone off guard, and Elena watched, stunned, as Grace's old pickup truck came barreling around the bend, horn blaring, headlights blazing, forcing the man in the green slicker to stagger sideways to avoid being struck, his rifle swinging wide in the sudden chaos. It was the opening Cale needed. He closed the distance in a blur of motion, disarming the man before he could recover his aim, and the remaining attackers, seeing their numbers and their advantage collapse within seconds, scrambled for their vehicles and fled, tires screaming against the gravel as they abandoned the ambush entirely. Grace's truck skidded to a stop beside them, and she leaned out the window, pale and shaking, but fiercely alert. "I followed those men the second they left the diner," she said. "I've been 3 cars back this whole time, trying to figure out what to do. Elena, are you all right?" Elena, trembling now that the immediate danger had passed, nodded shakily, and turned to find Cale already at her side, his hands cupping her face with a gentleness that contrasted starkly with the violence he had just unleashed on her behalf. "I thought I was going to lose you," he said, his voice breaking slightly on the words. "I have never in my life felt fear like that. Not for myself. Never like that. For someone else." "I'm all right," Elena said, though her voice shook as she said it. "You got there in time. We're both all right. But even as she said it, she understood, watching the shaken relief on his face and the retreating taillights of the men who had nearly succeeded in taking her, that this was no longer a danger that could be managed quietly. From the shadows, one confrontation at a time. Whoever Dorian truly was, whatever power he held over Cale's world, he had just proven he was willing to target her directly, and that meant the time for hiding, for careful half-truths and cautious patience, had finally, completely run out. I have to go back, Cale said quietly, watching her with an expression full of grief and resolve in equal measure. I have to face this directly, before my enemies decide that you are the easiest way to reach me. And when I go, Elena, I need you to know the whole truth of who I am, because you deserve to understand exactly what you would be walking into, if you choose to stand beside me for what comes next. They returned to the farmhouse with Grace following close behind, and once the doors were locked and the three of them sat together in the kitchen, the adrenaline of the ambush slowly draining from their bodies, Cale finally spoke the words he had been carefully avoiding since the very first night Elena had found him bleeding in that clearing. I am not simply a member of my pack, he said quietly, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he had not yet touched. I lead it. I am what my people call an alpha prince, heir to a bloodline that has held authority over these mountains for longer than any human town in this valley has existed. For the responsibility I mentioned before, the position that has made me enemies, it is the highest position my kind recognizes. Grace set down her own cup with a small clatter, staring at him with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and dawning understanding. A prince, she repeated slowly. You've been letting Elena feed you leftover chicken in a barn, and you're some kind of wolf royalty. It sounds absurd, said aloud in this kitchen, Cale admitted, a faint, tired smile touching his lips, despite the gravity of the conversation. But yes, and the man responsible for tonight's attack, the one my own trackers reported gathering information about Elena, is my cousin Dorian. He has wanted my position for as long as I can remember, and my extended absence, followed by the discovery of how deeply I care for the two of you, has apparently convinced him this is his best chance to finally take it. Elena absorbed this slowly, turning the pieces over in her mind, the weeks of careful evasion and half-truths finally resolving into a clearer, more complete picture. That's why the wolves came after you in the pasture, she said. That's why he's been watching us, learning our routines. He wasn't just trying to find you. He was trying to find a weakness he could use against you. Yes, Cale said simply, and he found exactly what he was looking for. Because I do care for you, more deeply than I have allowed myself to feel for anyone in a very long time, and that caring has apparently become the very leverage he needed to justify moving against me directly. So what happens now? Grace asked, her earlier skepticism giving way to genuine concern. You just go back up that mountain and confront him? I have to, Cale said. If I continue hiding here, Dorian will only escalate his methods, and next time, he may not settle for hired hunters or a handful of loyal wolves. He may bring the full weight of whatever support he's managed to gather within the pack itself, and that is a danger neither of you should have to face because of decisions I made to protect my own comfort, rather than confronting the truth sooner. Elena reached across the table and took his hand, her grip firm despite the exhaustion still evident in her posture. You're not going up there alone, she said. Elena, Cale started. The pack lands are dangerous for humans, especially now, with tensions already running as high as they are. I didn't ask if it was safe, Elena said, cutting him off gently, but firmly. I asked, or rather I'm telling you, that I'm not letting you walk into whatever is waiting for you up there, without me standing beside you. You didn't let me face those hunters alone in that clearing, all those weeks ago, even though you had no idea if you could trust me. I'm not about to return the favor by sitting quietly at home while you face down a cousin who's already tried twice to have you killed. Grace looked between them, something resigned settling over her expression. I don't like this, she said. Any of it. But I've known you long enough, Elena, to know there's no point arguing once you've made up your mind about something. Just promise me you'll be careful, both of you. Cale studied Elena for a long moment, something fierce and grateful and afraid all warring behind his eyes, and finally, slowly, he nodded. Then we go together, he said. But we go prepared, and we go understanding exactly what we're walking into. Dorian will not simply back down because I've returned. He has spent weeks, possibly longer, building support for whatever he intends to do next. When we arrive, we should expect that he has already prepared his own answer to my return. Outside, the night had grown fully dark, the mountains beyond the farm rising black and silent against a sky thick with stars, holding within their shadowed slopes a stronghold of ancient stone, where a council of elders waited anxiously for their missing prince, and a rival cousin sharpened his ambitions like a blade, certain that his moment, so carefully and patiently constructed, had finally arrived. Elena rose from the table as the conversation wound down, moving to the window to look out at those distant peaks, feeling for the first time the full and daunting scale of what she had unknowingly walked into on that stormy night weeks before, when all she had known was that something was hurting and needed her help. She had never imagined that single choice would lead her here, standing on the edge of a conflict between princes and rivals, preparing to walk into the heart of a world that operated by rules and dangers she was only just beginning to understand. But when she turned back to look at Kale, exhausted and scarred and utterly transformed from the wounded wolf she had first found in that clearing, she felt no regret at all, only a steady, unshakable certainty that whatever waited for them on that mountain, she intended to face it standing exactly where she had chosen to stand from the very beginning, right beside him. They left for the mountain stronghold at first light, Kale leading the way along paths only he could see clearly, Elena following close behind in sturdy boots and a borrowed jacket, her heart steady, despite the growing tension in the air, as the trees around them grew taller and older, the ordinary sounds of the valley gradually giving way to a deeper, watchful silence. Word of their approach traveled ahead of them, carried by wolves stationed along the outer boundaries, who recognized their prince immediately, despite his long absence. And by the time they crested the final ridge, and the stronghold came into view, carved into the mountainside in ancient gray stone, a crowd had already gathered to witness his return. Beatrice was the first to reach them, relief evident in every line of her weathered face, as she took in the sight of Kale, alive and largely healed, standing before her with a human woman at his side. "You're alive," she said, her voice tight with an emotion she rarely allowed herself to show openly. "We feared the worst." "I am alive," Kale confirmed, "no thanks to the wolves my cousin sent to ensure otherwise." A ripple of shocked murmurs moved through the gathering crowd, and Beatrice's expression hardened into something grim and knowing. "Dorian," she said quietly, "I suspected as much, though I lacked the proof to act on it." "You will have your proof today," Kale said, "before every elder and every member of this pack who cares to witness it." Word reached Dorian quickly, and he emerged from the stronghold's main hall with a composure that nearly held, though Elena, watching closely, caught the brief flicker of something calculating and afraid behind his eyes, as he took in the sight of his cousin, standing very much alive at the gathering center. "Kale," Dorian said smoothly, spreading his hands in a gesture of welcome that fooled no one who had spent the past weeks learning the truth. "We feared you lost. I am relieved beyond words to see you return safely." "Are you?" Kale said, his voice carrying easily across the gathered crowd, cold and clear as mountain water. "Because the wolves you sent to finish what those hired hunters failed to accomplish seemed considerably less pleased by the prospect of my survival." The crowd's murmurs sharpened into something closer to outrage, and Dorian's composed expression cracked, just slightly, before he could smooth it back into place. "I have no idea what you're referring to," he said. "Whatever attacks you suffered, I assure you, I had no part in them." "The brindle wolf who led that attack spoke your name directly," Kale said. "He told me, quite clearly, that you sent your regards. I imagine, if pressed properly before this council, he would be far less inclined to protect your involvement than you might hope." Dorian's gaze flicked briefly toward the crowd's edges, searching, and Elena watched real fear finally break through his composure, as he realized the brindle wolf and his companions, likely summoned in anticipation of exactly this confrontation, stood among the gathered pack, their loyalty to Dorian clearly wavering, now that the true cost of their obedience had come due in front of the entire community. "This is absurd," Dorian said, his voice rising, the careful mask finally slipping into something more desperate. "You would take the word of hired thugs and a human woman over the loyalty of your own blood?" "I would take the word of my own eyes," Kale said, "and the testimony of a woman who has shown me more honest loyalty in a few short weeks than you have managed in years of pretending to care for anything beyond your own ambition." Beatrice stepped forward then, her voice carrying the full weight of her authority among the elders. "Bring the wolves who attacked our prince before this council," she commanded, and within moments, guards moved through the crowd, locating the brindle wolf and his companions among those gathered, their earlier confidence collapsing entirely under the sudden, focused attention of the entire pack. The brindle wolf, faced with the certainty of exposure and the growing fury of a community that valued loyalty above almost everything else, made the calculation that self-preservation demanded. "It was Dorian," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned silence that followed. "He ordered the attack. He wanted our prince weakened, distracted, vulnerable enough that a final confrontation would favor him instead." Dorian's expression twisted, the careful ambition of years finally exposed before the very council he had spent so long manipulating, and something in him seemed to understand, in that moment, that there was no smooth explanation left capable of saving him. "You were never fit to lead," Dorian snarled, abandoning pretense entirely now that it had failed him. "Soft, distracted by a human woman, unwilling to make the hard choices leadership demands. I would have been a stronger prince than you have ever managed to be." "Perhaps," Cale said evenly, "if strength meant hiring humans to hunt your own cousin, and sending wolves to attack him while he lay wounded and recovering. But that is not the kind of strength this pack has ever valued, Dorian, and it is not the kind of strength I intend to lead with, now or ever." What happened next unfolded with a speed that left the gathered crowd gasping. Dorian, understanding that exposure meant the certain loss of everything he had worked toward, lunged forward in a final, desperate attempt to strike at Cale directly, his shape shifting mid-motion into the powerful wolf form he rarely displayed before the pack. Cale met the attack without hesitation, his own shift coming instantly, and Elena watched, breath caught somewhere between fear and awe, as the man she had nursed back to health in her barn transformed into something magnificent and terrifying, larger and more powerful than the wolf she had first found bleeding in that forest clearing. Every ounce of restraint he had shown throughout their weeks together, finally released in full. The confrontation was brief and utterly decisive. Cale's superior strength, honed through years of genuine leadership rather than mere ambition, overwhelmed Dorian within moments, pinning him to the ground before the entire gathered pack with a display of controlled, absolute power that left no doubt in anyone's mind about which of the two truly deserved the position they had fought over. Dorian, defeated and exposed, shifted back into his human form beneath his cousin's hold, all pretense finally stripped away, leaving only the bitter, hollow ambition that had driven him to this moment. "Finish it," Dorian spat, though his voice carried more fear than defiance now. "You have every right." Cale held his position a long moment, the entire crowd holding its breath, waiting to see what judgment their prince would deliver. Then, slowly, he stepped back, releasing his cousin without further violence. "I will not become the kind of leader who solves every conflict with a killing blow," Cale said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent gathering. "That has never been the strength this pack needs, and I will not let your ambition turn me into the very thing I have always fought against. You will be stripped of your standing among the elders, and you will be watched, closely, for the remainder of your days here. But you will live, Dorian, and perhaps in time you will understand that loyalty earns far more than ambition ever could." The crowd erupted into a low, murmuring wave of relief and renewed respect, and Beatrice stepped forward once more, addressing the gathered pack with the weight of her long authority. "Let it be known," she declared, "that our prince has returned to us not simply alive, but stronger and wiser for everything he has faced. And let it also be known that the woman standing beside him showed him a loyalty and courage that many among our own kind failed to match." Elena, standing at the center of so many watching eyes, felt the weight of the moment settle over her, the strange, surreal culmination of everything that had begun with a single desperate choice in a rain-soaked clearing weeks before. She looked at Cale, restored fully now to his human form, exhausted but unmistakably himself, and found in his eyes the same steady warmth she had come to know so well over their weeks together, undiminished by everything the pack had just witnessed him become. "It's over," she said softly, moving to stand beside him as the crowd began, slowly, to disperse. This part of it, yes, Kale said, taking her hand in his. But there is still one more thing I need to do, Elena. One more truth I need to speak, before I can truly call any of this finished. Before he could say more, Beatrice approached them both, her sharp gaze softening, as she studied Elena with open curiosity. You are the woman who saved him, she said. The one who pulled a wounded wolf from a hunter's trap without knowing what he truly was. I only did what anyone should have done, Elena said, feeling suddenly self-conscious beneath the elder's careful attention. Not anyone, Beatrice said. Very few humans would have risked themselves for a strange animal in the middle of a storm, and fewer still would have shown the patience to nurse him through weeks of recovery, asking nothing in return. Our prince has always been surrounded by those who wanted something from him. Power, favor, protection. You wanted nothing but to see him healed. That is rarer than you likely understand, in his world or in your own. Elena felt her cheeks warm at the elder's words, glancing toward Kale, who watched her with an expression of quiet, unguarded pride that she had not seen from him before, not even in their most private moments together. The council will need time to properly discuss what comes next, Beatrice continued, addressing Kale now with the practical tone of someone already anticipating the logistics ahead. Dorian's punishment, the restructuring of certain alliances he had begun to corrupt, the matter of rebuilding trust after weeks of uncertainty about your safety. But that can wait until morning. Tonight, I think, belongs to relief rather than politics. The pack's mood shifted noticeably as the day wore on, the earlier tension of Dorian's exposure giving way, slowly, to a kind of collective exhale. Wolves who had spent weeks anxious over their missing prince, finally allowing themselves to celebrate his safe and thoroughly vindicated return. A gathering formed near the stronghold's central hall as evening approached, simple food and firelight replacing the formal tension of the earlier confrontation, and Elena found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, welcomed into the celebration with a warmth she had not expected from a community she had only ever imagined as distant and dangerous. Several younger wolves approached her throughout the evening, curious and openly admiring, asking questions about the night she had found their prince, about the courage it must have taken to face down armed hunters without any of the strength or speed they themselves possessed. Elena answered as honestly as she could, though she found the attention faintly overwhelming, more accustomed to quiet evenings tending injured animals than to being the center of a celebration among an entire community of wolf shifters. Kale stayed close throughout, his hand finding hers whenever the crowd grew too dense, his presence a steady anchor amid the unfamiliar customs and traditions unfolding around her. She noticed, watching him move among his people, how different he seemed here than the exhausted, wary creature she had first tended in her barn. How naturally authority settled over him even in these more relaxed moments, tempered now by a warmth she suspected had been buried beneath years of careful, guarded leadership before she had ever entered his life. As the fire burned low and the celebration began to wind toward its natural end, Kale drew her gently away from the gathering, leading her to a quiet overlook where the mountain fell away into a valley, bathed in silver moonlight, the distant lights of her own small town, barely visible far below. They accepted me, Elena said softly, still faintly astonished by the evening's warmth. I expected suspicion, at best, maybe outright hostility. I didn't expect to be welcomed like that. You saved their prince, Kale said simply. And more than that, you loved him, without ever knowing what he was, without any of the reasons that usually draw attention to someone in my position. That is not something my people take lightly, Elena. Loyalty freely given, without calculation, is the rarest currency in our world, rarer even than the throne Dorian coveted so badly he was willing to betray his own blood for it. Elena looked out over the valley, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle into something steadier, more permanent than the uncertainty that had shadowed them both for so many weeks. So what happens now? She asked. You're a prince. I'm a veterinary volunteer who patches up farm dogs and barn owls. That's not exactly a matched set, is it? Kale turned to face her fully, something solemn and hopeful moving behind his eyes as he took both her hands in his. It is precisely the matched set I want, he said, if you are willing to have it. I have spent my entire life being what my position required of me. I would like, for whatever remains of it, to also be the man who spent quiet mornings drinking coffee too sweet for his own taste in your kitchen, and I would like that man to stand beside you, openly, for as long as you'll allow it." Elena felt tears gather unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, the accumulated weight of weeks of fear and uncertainty, and quiet, growing love finally breaking loose all at once. "You're asking me to choose a life I don't fully understand yet," she said softly. "Wolves, princes, councils, enemies who might still resent how tonight ended. That's a lot to walk into with my eyes open." "It is," Cale agreed, not flinching from the truth of it. "I will not pretend this life is simple, or free of danger, or easy to explain to the people you love in the valley below. Dorian is defeated, but not every wolf in this pack will fully trust a human at my side overnight. There will be challenges ahead, Elena, more than either of us can fully predict tonight." "But," Elena prompted, hearing the unspoken word hovering behind his careful honesty. "But I have never, in all my years of leadership, felt as certain of anything as I feel standing here with you," Cale said. "Not of my strength, not of my strategy, not of any decision I have made as prince of this pack. Only of this, only of you. And if that certainty is worth anything at all, I am asking you to choose it with me, knowing everything now that you didn't know the night you pulled me from that hunter's trap." Elena looked out over the moonlit valley one more time, thinking of the quiet, ordinary life she had built for herself down there, the clinic, the barn, the solitary evenings that had, until a few short weeks ago, felt like enough. She thought of the storm that had first brought her out into the trees, the desperate howl that had called to something stubborn and protective in her chest, the wolf who had walked toward her instead of away, choosing trust in the middle of his own worst pain. She thought of every quiet morning since, every conversation shared in a barn that neither of them had known was carrying far more meaning than simple company for a recovering animal. "I already made my choice," she said finally, turning to face him fully, her voice steady despite the tears still bright in her eyes. "I made it the night I heard you howling in that clearing, and decided to get out of my truck instead of driving away. Everything since then has just been me finding out exactly how much that first choice was going to ask of me, and I'm still here, Cale. I'm still choosing you, princes and packs and everything else included." The relief and joy that broke across his face in that moment was unlike anything she had seen from him before. The careful, guarded composure of a leader, giving way entirely to something purely, simply human. He pulled her close, and for a long moment they simply stood together at the mountain's edge. The valley spread silver and quiet below them, the weight of everything they had survived finally settling into something that felt, at last, like peace rather than danger. The following weeks brought changes neither of them could have fully anticipated. Dorian, stripped of his standing among the elders, withdrew from pack politics entirely, a diminished and watched presence, whose ambitions had cost him everything he had once hoped to gain. Beatrice, in the months that followed, became something of an unlikely mentor to Elena, teaching her the customs and history of a world she was slowly, carefully learning to navigate, patient with her questions, in a way that eased much of the anxiety she had carried about her place among Cale's people. Grace, once she had recovered from the shock of learning the full truth, proved surprisingly unbothered by the revelation that her closest friend had fallen in love with a wolf-shifter prince. "Honestly," she said, the first time Elena tried to properly explain everything, "at this point, I'm mostly annoyed you kept me in suspense for so long. I want details, all of them, starting with how exactly wolf weddings work, because I assume there's a wedding coming, and I fully expect to be invited." There was, in time, a wedding, held not within the formal stone halls of the stronghold, but in the open pasture of Elena's own farm, where it had all first begun weeks and then months before. Wolves and humans stood together beneath a canopy strung with lantern light, an unlikely gathering that Beatrice presided over with evident satisfaction, declaring before both communities that loyalty, courage, and love, freely given, without calculation, would always outweigh the ambition and fear that had nearly cost their prince everything. Cale stood at the center of it all in his human form, dressed simply, watching Elena walk toward him, across the same grass where he had once lain bleeding, after fighting off 3 attacking wolves, where she had first discovered the truth of what he was, and chosen, without hesitation, to stay anyway. He thought, watching her approach, of every careful calculation he had made throughout his life as prince, every alliance weighed, and every enemy measured, and understood that none of it had ever prepared him for the simple, overwhelming certainty of choosing someone not for what she could offer his position, but simply because she had once knelt in the rain beside a wounded stranger and refused to walk away. "I told you once," Elena said quietly as she reached him, a private smile touching her lips, "that I'd make the same choice again, every single time. I meant it then. I mean it now." "And I told you," Cale replied, taking her hands in his, "that meeting you in that clearing was the most fortunate accident of my entire life. I have had many months since to reconsider that word, accident, and I have decided I no longer believe it applies. I believe you were always going to find me that night, exactly as you did, exactly when you did." The barn where it had all begun still stood at the edge of the property, though it now served a gentler purpose, home to whatever injured creature Elena's clinic sent her way. A quiet monument to the night, a single act of unconditional kindness had reshaped two very different worlds into one. Visitors to the farm, human and wolf alike, would sometimes ask about the old straw-filled corner near the feed bins, and Elena would tell them, simply, that it was where she had once nursed a stray wolf back to health, never imagining that the creature she saved carried a crown far heavier than the wound she had bandaged that first stormy night. She never regretted the choice, not once, not through every difficulty that followed in the months and years ahead, the careful balancing of two worlds, the occasional lingering suspicion from wolves who still struggled to fully trust a human at their prince's side, the quiet challenges of building a life that belonged fully to neither the valley below nor the mountain above, but to something new entirely, forged between the two. Because in the end, what she had found in that rain-soaked clearing had never truly been a stray animal in need of rescue. It had been the beginning of a life she could not have imagined for herself, built on the simple, unshakable truth that had guided her out of her truck and into the storm on that very first night, and that continued to guide her through every challenge that followed. Some things were worth saving, without knowing yet what they might become, and some choices, made in a single desperate moment beneath a dark and thundering sky, turned out to be the truest and most important choices of an entire lifetime.